When people ask why I consider creativity to be so important in education, the simple answer is that when there's creativity in classes, there's practical value, inspiration, and growth. What do we mean by creativity? Like many of my colleagues, I always considered myself to be a creative teacher because instead of using textbooks and pre-planned materials, I always enjoy creating interesting, up-to-date resources so that neither my students nor I get bored. It wasn't until I started working with inner London teenagers about 10 years ago that I realised creating my own teaching resources just wasn't enough. I had to distinguish between teaching creatively and teaching for creativity. Until then, I'd been teaching English to adults, but the teaching strategies I'd used skillfully with the adults just didn't work as well with the teenagers. When I tried to encourage my younger students to think for themselves and to collaborate on projects where they had to take initiative, make decisions, and evaluate each other's work, they tended to rely too much on me. And many of them resented me for expecting them to teach themselves. That's when I realised that being creative and resourceful myself was not the same as teaching my students to be creative and resourceful. Most of them couldn't remember ever being taught how to be creative during their compulsory school education. This unfortunate gap in our education system inspired me to research for a PhD to explore how well we develop creativity skills in the vocational business curriculum. As part of my thesis, I synthesized some of the existing research on creativity from 1926 onwards to highlight 7 attributes of this concept, which I call the 7 P's of creativity: the process, the person, the place, the pressures, the products, persuasion, and permanence. I'll briefly explain how I incorporate each of these attributes to ensure that there's creativity and therefore value, growth, and inspiration in my lessons. First of all, the creative process. Graham Wallace in 1926 published a book called The Art of Thought, and he suggested there are 4 stages in the creative process: preparation, incubation, illumination, and verification. I believe these 4 stages are cyclical like the seasons and like the cycles of a fruit seed. Preparation is like preparing the soil and planting the seeds. Incubation is like watering the seeds without digging them up. Illumination is like the flower buds transforming into blossoms. And verification is like the fruit which is tested for how sweet or how sour it is. Using this metaphor in each lesson, we prepare the soil and plant some seeds of new knowledge. The students are encouraged to reflect on this new content at home, which is like watering the seeds we've planted. We start to see the buds and the blossoms when the new content triggers fresh ideas in class discussions and debates. Finally, in the 4th stage, students produce work for their assignments, which is like the fruit, which is tested and evaluated by their peers until it seems ripe enough and ready to be passed on to me. Students find it worth making the effort to attend my lessons because each lesson contains some new information, even though it may only be a short and succinct 10 to 15 minute presentation. It's always packed and relevant with valuable information that they can't just read in a textbook. Besides the new content, there are activities which students couldn't easily do at home because they involve interaction with their peers, to practice and to churn knowledge and skills that we've learnt previously. The second P of creativity is the person. When I started teaching 30 years ago, I thought it was part of my job to motivate my students to learn. With experience, I realised that students are always naturally motivated to learn when it's something they are genuinely interested in. So I started to plan my lessons around who I was teaching rather than what I was teaching. Once we've mastered our subject, I find that most of our lesson planning revolves around figuring out how to make what we need to teach relevant to each of our students. As I get to know my students and they realise I'm tailoring the content for them, the lessons become increasingly useful, relevant and valuable. In my early teaching career, I also made the mistake of labelling my students with what I believed to be positive or negative character traits. For example, I'd describe a student as being hardworking or lazy. I'd see some students as being popular with their classmates, and I'd see others as being disruptive. As I gained experience and confidence as a teacher, I realised that these are not fixed character traits, but behaviours that students express in response to their contextual environment. Using the Chinese concept of yin and yang, where masculine energy merges into feminine energy and vice versa, I realised that each of these behaviours is malleable, fluid and transient in response to the environment. In other words, behaviour that I call disruptive may be considered influential in another context. A student may seem to be lazy when actually they just aren't interested in the subject. When they're working on something that truly excites them, they may seem to be totally engrossed and very hard-working indeed. This leads us to the third P of creativity, which is the place. I tend to favour a humanist teaching approach following the psychological and educational theories of Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow and John Holt. So I focus on creating a classroom environment where there's trust, safety and inspiration. I encourage my students to increase their level of confidence and to have the courage to take risks. Sometimes this feels like digging the soil and pulling out the weeds, such as fear, bullying, and prejudices. The fourth P of creativity is the pressures that each student and we as their teachers will have to overcome in order to successfully complete the course. I like to identify these pressures very early in the course through a SWOT analysis where we look at our strengths, our weaknesses, opportunities and threats. Students do their individual SWOT analysis and then we collate our list to make a class list of the threats, for example, the pressures. This collective list of pressures helps students to see that each one of us, myself included, will be facing similar pressures of fear, anxiety and stress, and only the details will be different. For each pressure in the threat category of the SWOT analysis, we identify its antidote in the opportunities box. For example, the opportunity to give and receive support and to develop our skills in resourcefulness. The fifth P of creativity is the product. Products have to be original and valuable to fulfill the criteria of creativity. So in my lessons, students learn to apply knowledge and to develop their practical skills by creating services and products such as real newsletters, informative podcasts, and exciting business events which add value to their own lives and to the lives of other stakeholders in the community. The sixth P of creativity is persuasion. In business, if we can't persuade others of the value of our services and products, we're unlikely to be profitable. So we organise business networking events which create opportunities for students to develop their skills in persuasion through mentoring and coaching by successful business people. The seventh P in creativity is permanence. The well-known educator Fontana said that unless we are changed in some way, learning cannot be said to have taken place. Likewise, creativity leaves its mark through a change in the way we think, feel, or behave. I believe that in formal compulsory education, learning should be an integral aspect of growth and self-development. So, in my lessons, I encourage my students to constantly expand their comfort zones by finding out new knowledge, exploring the connections between what they already know and this new knowledge, and by applying their knowledge and skills to new situations in real-life contexts. Through this practical application, students experience growth and self-development, so learning and creativity leave a permanent mark on the students' self-awareness and their relationship to the external world. We make sure that we take the practical learning and creativity that we've generated in the classroom, outside the classroom, to real-life situations. For example, through exciting field trips, we synthesize and consolidate knowledge and further refine the skills we've learnt in class. So, when there is creativity in classes, there's always some new knowledge being planted in each lesson, while previously learnt knowledge is being cultivated and harvested when it's ripe and ready. Teaching creatively and teaching for creativity means that through collaboration, every single student gains value, and not just the average, the middle, or the majority in a large class.